We have ASL and LSQ available on site here and also on the live stream. If you have any questions at all about accessibility services, just please ask at the registration table and they will help you. I guess I just wanted to say as well, a special thank you to the Federal Government Office for Disability Issues for making available, allowing us to have all of this wonderful accessibility. They've covered the cost of that today. And it's not working. And we are extremely grateful. I am just been told that the captioning is not working. Okay. I'm not even sure what to say about that. Except that we will get the captioning working again. Are we okay now? Well, we can't go without cart services. Just not going to happen. So we're going to wait a minute. They are working on it. They are trying to fix it. So I'm not going to say too much more because we don't have cart services, but I will say and I will repeat this when we get cart again, there's coffee and tea at the back of the room. So feel free to grab one. So we are just going to give it a minute to see if we can get the technical difficulties with the cart sorted out, because there are also people watching online that are accessing the cart services. Technology is so good when it works and so terrible when it doesn't. Frankly, it seems like it doesn't more than it does. Come right in, just find a seat. Well, Minister Lametti had let us know that he was going to be a couple minutes late. He might be right on time. He likely will be right on time when he arrives. The
first two videos are captioned. Would you like to start with the videos that are captioned?
Okay. Okay, so we're going to alter the agenda just a tiny bit. We were planning, after Steve and I made opening remarks, we were planning to start with a video, and the video is captioned. So we're going to start with the video while they're sorting out the cart, and we'll go back to the opening remarks later. So with that, no, still not working. With that, I think we'll turn your attention to the screen for our first presentation that's going to get us started.
People typically don't see how I live my life. They look at you in the wheelchair, they look at what you cannot do. I think they put themselves in that situation, and maybe they think, oh, I would want to die, I couldn't do that. But they don't know me. I manage very well in the community through a program called direct funding. Attendants do whatever you need to do in your daily life. Because I hire them, I'm able to flourish and live a life because of the opportunities it gives me. I've had amazing longevity with my staff. And that enables me to do what I do, like going to board meetings or going out socially, doing stuff on the computer, or being creative. We went to England. My father was posted there, going to a military school. And then in the summer of when I was 9, I remember going out to play with my friends one day and walking halfway down the lane and feeling like I didn't feel very well. So I turned around, came back, and went up the stairs. And then within a very short while, the doctor came. I can remember being carried down the stairs on the stretcher and into the ambulance and all the neighbors watching. And then being taken to the hospital, and I remember saying, I can't breathe. And they carried me into the next room and put me in the iron lung. Polio is a virus that attacks the front part of the spinal cord. And that is where the messages come from movement. Most people who had polio never got any paralysis. It was like a summer flu. So I got affected by it fairly significantly. Yeah, I think many times people have thought I wouldn't be here. For example, when I came back to Canada, the doctor said, well, there's nothing we can do, she'll never walk again. But then when I got back to school, and by grade 12, was a top student, I overheard the conversation between my surgeon and another surgeon saying, she's very bright, we should see if there's anything we can do. And then they decided to transfer a tendon in my hand so I could move my thumb like this. And I can remember being horrified and thinking that, why didn't they do that in the beginning? Why did I have to prove myself? When I was going to university, I had been on probation the first year because they accepted me into university, but they thought I probably couldn't do it. All these barriers that put people down. I always get the flu vaccine every year, but the flu vaccine last year didn't properly cover influenza B. So I got sick with that about day before Christmas, I think. And within 2 days it was pneumonia, and I got admitted to hospital. Things became very difficult. I was intubated, and then I had atrial fibrillation, and then I had to have a tracheostomy. I think I nearly died about 3 times. Suffering to me would mean that you're in pain, periods of depression. When I was not doing well, I didn't know where I was going or how I was going to end up. So that was a very difficult time. Giovanna, my daily attendant, heard two nurses one night talking to each other, and they were saying it was such a shame that they were keeping me alive because hadn't I had enough.
And they were saying, why did they let her go? Why are they wasting, you know? She should die, just like that. And I turn and they say, quiet, because I hear it. This is the third time I'm with you that the same thing happened, you know. This is the third time. You have to be a fighter all the time, you see.
Well, I've heard that before. I've had friends with disabilities, and they've overheard conversations like that.
If it's your own mother or your own sister, auntie, do you want them to die, just like that?
If it hadn't been for Joanna and Rebecca being with me and getting very loud and noisy about what they were seeing or what they were worrying about, I think I would not have been first priority. Staff look at your body, and if you're very sick, they kind of wonder what kind of life is possible, and I think people with significant disabilities, I think it's very dangerous to be alone in a hospital. I've traveled a lot, I've spoken at different countries, I've gone into a lot of crazy adventures that people never expected. I've checked off a lot on my bucket list, but I've never thought of it as a bucket list. I've just thought of it as what do I want to do next. I think I've achieved a lot. And I'm kind of proud of what I've done when people thought I wouldn't be able to do anything.
Okay, so we have the cart back up and working. Wonderful. Love it when the technology works. Steve, come right up here with me. So hello, everyone. My name is Krista Kerr, and I am the Executive Vice President of the Canadian Association for Community Living.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Steve Esty. I'm the Interim National Coordinator with the Council of Canadians with Disabilities. We'd like to begin this morning by acknowledging the land that we're on is a traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. We're grateful to have them here, have the opportunity to be here and to present on the territory. We'd also like to acknowledge the huge effort of many people to bring us here together today. I'd like to acknowledge as well the presence of Ministers Qualtrough and Lametti, and say that we have regrets from Minister Hajdu, who, for those of you who watch the news, will understand she's a little bit busy with other things, but she's certainly with us in spirit, I think. So we're very appreciative to have the ministers here with us this morning to be able to share our views. We also have a number of MPs and senators in the room, and I think that's very important as well. So thank you all for joining us on such a busy time of the year, and thanks for listening.
And for those of you, Steve and I have a little height difference here. For those of you joining us online, you can submit your questions for inclusion in the Q&A portion at the end of the event to forum@cacl.ca. And so now, without further ado from Steve and I'd like to turn your attention directly to the screen. We are going to begin our first panel presentation with some words from Dr. Catherine Frazee.
I'm Catherine Frazee. I greet you today from the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq First Nation. I am a settler here, and from this place I offer my words in a spirit of respect for elders among us, both past and present. We have much to learn today and always from their histories of belonging that have been erased and forgotten. We have much to learn from traditional ways of stewardship and care. Honorable ministers, with the courts March 11 deadline looming, we know that you are in a race against time. And in that context, it must be said that we appreciate the commitment that you have made to be present at this forum today. I begin with that acknowledgement and I thank you. We also have been in that race. It began for us on September 11, 2019, when the Quebec Superior Court in Turchin and Gladue ruled against you, and we rose up in full-throated support of an appeal that only you could initiate. We rallied the troops. 72 disability organizations and allied organizations across the country joined the chorus. Hundreds of allies in the medical profession signed on in an open letter. We knew we would be outnumbered, but we fought to be heard. Numbers, we urged, have no place in deciding questions that bear on the very core of our equality. But the deadline for appeal passed, and now we race toward a new law. You have set the pace for this sprint, and we have fallen in line. In good faith and on your invitation, the people in this room, many of them, labored day and night to advance a proposal that would refine and reinforce the legislative objectives that the Quebec court had dismissed out of hand. Robbed of the option of appeal, we pressed for a Supreme Court reference as our bulwark against the irreparable harm if illness, disease, and disability become a zone of exemption to all social and legal prohibitions against the deliberate termination of life. Regrettably, our proposal was met with resounding silence, and the clock keeps ticking. Government representatives speak of this crossroads as a time of moving forward, assuring us that medical practitioners are now more comfortable when called upon to hasten death, and that Canadians at large have high degrees of acceptance of this practice. Removing the end-of-life requirement for MAiD is increasingly framed as a victory for human autonomy. We can see where this is going. And today we have come not to surrender, but to reclaim the spirit of autonomy that animates our march toward equality. The spirit of true autonomy, substantive autonomy, the autonomy that our elders and movement leaders fought for, the freedom to choose how and where we would live, not if we would live at all. That is a preposterous, ableist aberration of autonomy, and we reject it absolutely. Today we are not giving up the race, but henceforth we will set our own pace. This is not a sprint, but a marathon. It is a marathon that disabled Canadians can trace back decades to the high-stakes battle for basic recognition in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It is a marathon during which our labors gained momentum in the grueling negotiations to articulate the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and to blaze the difficult trail toward Canada's ratification of the Convention and accession to its optional protocol. And it is a marathon that will continue well past March 11 as we press forward on the uphill climb to defend our equal dignity and value against the runaway impact of a shattered human rights norm. To reinvent MAiD so that it is no longer an alternative to a painful death, but for some instead an alternative to a painful life. To do that is to embrace uncritically the dangerous notion that suffering associated with disability is a burden greater than death, and that termination of such a life is a benefit worthy of protection in law. Today we plant a flag on the frozen landscape of Canada's body politic. We plant a flag to stand as a reminder to ourselves and others and generations of disabled citizens who will follow in our tracks that once, briefly, we tasted equality under the law. We bear witness today that autonomy was once the life force of our progress, not some toxic discharge of ableist conviction. From this marker, our marathon continues. And let there be no mistake, we are capable marathoners. Remember, Terry Fox was our guy. And like Terry, we will be propelled by the respect and support of those who believe in us, endure with us, and cheer us on. If you want to help us, keep us nourished as we strive, give us clean air to breathe and safe and welcome harbor at the end of each day. Do not recoil from our struggle, but join us in it. Do not come to the marathon to beckon us to the sidelines because we suffer, to remind us of this strange and thin autonomy and the all-important choice to quit. Do not, at every perilous and painful turn, construct and institutionalize autonomy traps, elaborate laws and protocols for the fulfillment of surrender. Marathons are hard. Don't make them harder. When we stumble, lift us up and dust us off and get us back onto the track. When we are broken and the end of life approaches, then and only then should there be talk of MAiD. Expanding medically assisted death so that it is not only for those who are dying, but also exclusively for those who have some illness, disease, or disability, makes us a special case for ending a difficult life. This categorically sends one and only one message. We are not needed. Whatever gifts we bring to the world, gifts of mind and heart and body, these gifts are not of such value that Canada will fight for us to live. So there you have it, ministers, our closing argument. From law and ethics and history and the wisdom of experience, here follows our closing argument before the court of political will. And now, Bonnie and Corey, my fellow panelists, it's over to you. Please speak your truth and be heard. Take your time.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks, Catherine, for that as well. First of all, I want to thank you on behalf of People First Canada for inviting us here to speak on this very important issue, as it's really important to our members across this country. My name is Corey Earle, and I am the president of People First of Canada. People First of Canada is a national voice for people labeled with an intellectual disability. The world of intellectual disability is a difficult place. There is a basic struggle to be included in ways that many people outside the world can't even begin to understand. Nothing is easy. Along with that, most people outside in the world of intellectual disability and disability in general all think we are suffering. But people with intellectual disabilities are not suffering from having an intellectual disability. People with Down syndrome or fetal alcohol syndrome disorder or autism or any other kind of intellectual disability we will not usually die from it. Like everyone else in our country, we usually die from cancers and diseases and other incidents. What we do suffer from is high rates of poverty. We're also suffering from extremely low rates of employment. Unfortunately, many of us suffer from violence and abuse more than any other groups in society. Many of us suffer from poor health care. We're not often treated well in our own healthcare system. We're not given enough time and information in plain language. Often we're unable to get the right supports for our mental health needs because we have an intellectual disability. Our mental health and our disability become mixed up. And many of us suffer from being excluded and isolated. We weren't included in school or after school. We don't have jobs. We don't have the money to go out and do things. If the medical assistance in dying laws are opened up so that this suffering helps us to qualify for medical assistance in dying, it will make it easier for us to die using the process. If it wasn't so sad, it would almost be funny, and I will tell you why. Like I said, everything, and I mean everything, is more difficult for people with intellectual disabilities. Many, many other things should be made easier. This is not one of them. But I can tell you that what should be made easier for people with intellectual disabilities, it should be made easier for us to live in our community. We need access to safe and affordable housing. We should not be homeless, but many of us are. We should not live in fear of being put in an institution, but many of us do. It should be made easier to get a good education. Most people with intellectual disabilities, myself included, have had not good education, have not had good education. Some have had no education. We need inclusive classrooms and schools and policies. It should be easier for us to get a decent paying job so we don't have to live in poverty. People with intellectual disabilities have a very low rate of employment. We need more inclusive employers and businesses. It should be made easier for us to be included and to have friends and be part of our communities. But we're often left out, and many of us have a few friends, if any. We need a disability support to allow us to have a social life of some kind and should be included. We need better rates. We need better rates of assistance. It should be easier to get help when we're being abused or harmed. It should. We are also assaulted and abused more than other groups in society, and we look for help. We're often not believed. Our cases are thrown out of courts because our words are not credible. We need a justice system that will accommodate our disability with extra time and plain language. It should be easier for us to exercise our legal capacity. We can make our own decisions and choices. It will look different for every one of us, just like it is different for all of you. With the right support, we can make our own decisions. But people continually judge us as not being able to run our own lives. They question our right to make our own decisions. They see our disability and they decide we can't. There are a lot of things that we can and should be made easier for people with intellectual disabilities in our country and in our society. But making it easier to use medical assistance and dying to end our own lives is not one of them. Thank you, everyone.
Mic one, it's on? Okay, thank you. Bonjour, good morning. My name is Bonnie Brayton, and I'm the National Executive Director of DAWN Canada, the Disabled Women's Network of Canada. Bonjour tout le monde, mon nom est Bonnie Brayton.
Hi everyone, I'm Bonnie Brayton, and I'm the Executive Director of the DAWN Network of Canada.
This morning I'm going to ask you an abridgment of the affidavit that my past president, the late Carmela Hutchison, prepared in March 2019 for the Julia Lamb case. I'm a mental health and disability advocate with lived experience of both physical and mental illness. I served in various capacities at the National Network for Mental Health. I also acted as the president of the Disabled Women's Network of Canada. I'm currently president of the Alberta Network for Mental Health. I have provided input into policy at federal, provincial, and municipal levels of government. In my spare time, something from Carmela's spare time, I provide telephone and practical support to my fellow mental health consumers, assist in facilitating support groups, and present educational workshops on mental illness and disability. My life's work has been in the field of mental health, which has involved both the prevention of suicide and the promotion of good mental health for Canadians. I worked as a nurse in a 25-bed inpatient unit for patients experiencing chronic psychiatric illness. I later provided inpatient care to young people experiencing difficulties with their mental health. I then worked for an adult inpatient unit for patients experiencing acute psychiatric illness before becoming a mental health therapist. At the age of 29, I was injured in a rollover car accident. I was ultimately diagnosed with thoracic and lumbar scoliosis, and I underwent extensive physiotherapy for a period of 2 years. 3 days after the accident, I had a panic attack and I could not stop crying. I was treated in emergency at the hospital and released with a diagnosis of post-concussion syndrome. Following this episode, I decided to set up with a therapist. I was given an entrance diagnosis of major depression and an exit diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder, otherwise known as multiple personality disorder. My health situation became even more complicated when doctors had to remove my left ovary. This was followed by the removal of my right ovary after doctors identified another tumor. The following year, I underwent a hysterectomy. At this point in our lives, my husband and I were paying $1,100 a month in medical expenses, only some of which were covered by insurance. The financial stress of it all was daunting. In 1994, I received 6 new diagnoses: bilateral carpal tunnel syndrome, bilateral osteoarthritis, diabetes mellitus type 2, fatty liver secondary to diabetes, fibromyalgia, and mild hearing impairment. In 2010, I was diagnosed with an aortic stenosis. My cardiologist explained that I would likely live between 2 to 10 years with this diagnosis before requiring an operation that I may not withstand. I'm now in the 9th year of this 10-year stretch of life expectancy. Immediately after my accident, I was worried that I would never feel useful or have purpose again. My mind had been the instrument by which I had made my living, and I felt that it was broken as a result of my brain injury and subsequent mental health diagnosis. Since that time, I have come to see the rich value in my life, notwithstanding my medical stresses. Unfortunately, I find that most people I meet bring their own negative assumptions about what life must be like with my particular set of conditions and disabilities. In December 2015, I was admitted to the hospital severely ill. The next thing that I remember, I was waking up in intensive care unit with a breathing tube, struggling against wrist restraints that were uncomfortably tight. I tried to signal to my nurse that my restraints needed to be loosened and to communicate that I would not pull out my breathing tube. Clearly not understanding me, the nurse replied to my gestures by saying, "I know the tube is miserable. I'd kill myself if I had to have one." I had just woken up from a medically induced coma and I was scared and disoriented. The first message I received was not that everything was going to be okay, but for that nurse that it would be better to be dead than to be in my situation. Despite what others may assume, I know that my life has meaning and purpose. Even when I was in ICU and could not speak, I was still able to contribute to my community. I sent Christmas text messages. I signed documents. I gave input into important decisions being discussed by the Board of Dawn and the Alberta Network for Mental Health. I even gave presentations to Parliament and to the University of Alberta from my hospital bed. One of my friends used to say, if you can lick a postage stamp, you can become involved in the mental health movement. I can tell you now, in my experience, that you only need to be able to blink your eye, sip, puff, speak, or point a finger to be involved in life, in the world around you, and in the disability movement. As a disabled woman, what I need from my government is to help live my life freely and independently. I need accessible medical care, home care, community-based supports, employment, and support in being active and engaged in my community. I need access to mental health services, trauma-informed treatment, and other daily supports. I do not need help to die. I want to stay focused on creative solutions to helping people with disabilities live. I am personally fearful of the expansion of MAiD. Disability alone is not and should not be considered a grievous and irremediable medical condition for the purposes of accessing MAiD. Expanding access to include people with disabilities who are not otherwise at the end of life would tell me that my government believes my life lacks value. It would make me feel like my life isn't worth saving, which has implications for the way in which I access healthcare. If MAiD is expanded to individuals with disabilities who are not at the end of life, I am concerned that I will delay treatment and refuse to go to hospital or ambulance alone. I believe that I have a right to feel safe and protected when I go to the hospital, just like every other Canadian. The contemplated expansion of MAiD has compromised that sense of safety and security for me because I believe it says something about how far our society and our medical professions will go to save my life.
It just takes a second to collect yourself after all of that. I guess I was born with my bladder a little too close to my eyes. I wanted to say thank you, Catherine, Bonnie, Carmela, Corey. Your experiences and perspectives ground our discussion here today. Your fears are legitimate. I'd like to read you a snippet from a case file from the Netherlands that recounts the type of suffering that triggered a medically assisted death in a young man who lived with Asperger's, autism spectrum disorder. Here's the quote. The patient was a man in his 30s. He suffered from the fact that he had a great need for closeness with others, whilst he couldn't maintain long-lasting social contacts. This was because he misjudged interactions and was inclined to behavior that crossed boundaries. He suffered from his continuous yearning for meaningful relationships and his repeated frustrations in this area because of his inability to deal adequately with the closeness of social contacts. That was the type of suffering that triggered a medically assisted death in a country who has a regime for medical assistance in dying, much like the one being contemplated here in our country. I can't help but think that this type of suffering is not inherent to disability. This type of suffering is caused by how we collectively treat people with disabilities. On that note, we have a panel, a wonderful, prestigious panel that has arrived on the scene here. I am going to act as a bit of a timekeeper, so I am going to give our panelists a yellow card when they have 5 minutes left. And when I stand up waving a red card, it's time to it's time to wrap up. But before that, just because this seems like, and I don't want to put anybody on the spot here, it just seems like a logical bit of a break. I know that Minister Lametti can only be with us until 11 o'clock today. We're very grateful that he has been able to join us, and I know his staff, I think, will stay with us. But I wanted to give, this is not a Q&A session yet. We are going to get to a Q&A session later. I just wanted to give him an opportunity to maybe have some reflections or say a few words before he has to go. I'm hoping he can still stay to 11, but this seems like a good break before we transition into another panel that he might have a few words for us. And again, thank you, Minister Lametti, if you would like to come forward.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for inviting me. It's obviously important for me to be here to hear your voices, to live and hear your shared experiences, and to learn from them. And I think I'm doing that. My team is doing it. I'm with Minister Qualtrough, and I see Dan Albus here, and other parliamentarians. It is critically important that we value life in all its forms, and that we as a government, and governments, provincial governments, territorial governments as well, realize that we need to do better in allowing people to flourish and live in the way that they want to live and choose to live. And in order, therefore, to make autonomy, as Catherine Frazee said, a real and robust concept. And so I think we've heard that. We're trying to strike a balance in the legislation that values autonomy, but I understand personally that in order to make that a real option for people, that we also place a great deal more emphasis on how to allow people to live, and how to allow people to live well in the way that they choose to live. So with that, I thank you. I will be here till 11, and then I will quietly slip out. But my team will continue to be here, and I believe Minister Qualtrough will be staying. So again, I thank you for the learning that you're giving me this morning.
Hi, Laverne. I think we're ready for your speech.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Good morning. My name is Laverne Jacobs. I'm a law professor and the Associate Dean of Research and Graduate Studies at the University of Windsor Faculty of Law. I'm very grateful to be here today, and I thank you for the invitation. I thank the ministers as well for attending. I research and teach in the areas of law and disability, human rights, and administrative law. I'm also a Black woman and a person with physical disabilities. This consultation has focused on specific issues relating to MAiD, namely eligibility, safeguards, and advanced requests. These are all very important topics, but permeating all of these topics is an issue that is of primary importance and that should be front and center, and that's the issue of stigma. In my introduction for this coming panel, I'm going to focus on how the stigma of people with disabilities is perpetuated through the MAiD legislation, and what this legislation and the key government actors need to do in order to ensure that people with disabilities do not face social inequality as a result of MAiD. It's useful to begin this discussion, I think, with an analogy that takes us outside of the very many tangled pieces relating to medical assistance in dying. So I want to open up this dialogue by asking you to think about the situation of racial stigma faced by African Americans. Racial stigma is a concept that looks beyond the actions of individuals to investigate the structure of social relations within which people act. It considers how people's perceptions are affected by social relations and how social relations also shape people's explanations of the world around them. In the United States, the racial stigma experienced by African Americans is pervasive. To give just one strong example, racial stigma is at the basis of common everyday explanations given for why the African American community has faced the greatest incarceration rates amongst demographic groups. Common everyday explanations look not to the policies and systems of incarceration, but rather see the issue as a problem caused or not prevented by African Americans within their own communities. In other words, the demographic group is identified as being problematic when a thorough investigation would find many of the problems experienced by the group to be connected to historical, socioeconomic, and legal structures. actors in society. I argue that the situation of racial stigma is very similar to the situation that we are facing here today with MAiD. As a result of social structures that are being based on biased understandings of social existence, inequality becomes often not just a set of individual circumstances, but part of a much larger web of systemic discrimination. And what's particularly troubling about any system or any structure of systemic discrimination is that once ideas that are harmful to a minority group have been legislated into law, it's very difficult to convince the general public that they are not stigma-inducing or ultimately discriminatory. So in both cases, in both the case of racial inequality in the US and the case of MAiD here in Canada, we're dealing with the stigmatization of a historically disadvantaged group, and the stigma itself has caused harm to the group. However, we're privileged today to be in a position to learn from the mistakes of the past and to prevent our legislation from continuing to systemically stigmatize people with disabilities. The question now is how to do that. How do we strip the structure of our legislation of ableist understandings of social existence? I argue that we cannot allow access to MAiD without ensuring protection of the disability community from stigma. Moreover, the government should not be allowing MAiD if it is not also enabling those with disabilities to have the supports they need to live a fulsome life when they choose to do so, at all stages of life, including at the end of life. The topic of medical assistance in dying presents two very different visions of equality. The first is a formalistic vision of equality that asks for likes to be treated alike. This is the type of equality that underlies the Truchon decision of last September. The idea fought for and won in Truchon is that all people with disabilities should be given the same opportunity to obtain death. However, this is a very narrow and problematic conception of equality. There are many reasons for this. It does not address the substantive implications of saying that it's okay to seek medical assistance to die if one is disabled, and regardless of the stage of life that you're in. It certainly does not inquire about whether the label of being MAidable furthers the historical disadvantage of the disability community as a whole. And finally, it does nothing to ensure that the social situation of people with disabilities as a community is ameliorated overall. Indeed, this conception of equality also runs contrary to the principles of the UN CRPD Committee's interpretive guidance on the notion of equality under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which Canada ratified and which came into force for Canada in 2010. In March 2018, the UN Committee for this convention adopted its general comment number 6. This comment was on equality and discrimination under the convention, and as I mentioned, it offered interpretive guidance. The UN Committee sketched out a new model of equality called inclusive equality that should guide equality and discrimination matters under the CRPD. The committee stated that the inclusive equality model embraces substantive as opposed to formal equality, but that it also elaborates on it. And it elaborates on it by bringing in a few important dimensions. So 2 of these dimensions are particularly germane to the discussion here today. The first one is a recognition dimension. The recognition dimension combats stigma, stereotyping, prejudice, and violence, and recognizes the dignity of persons with disabilities and their intersectionality. In my interpretation, this means that the government should find ways to avoid harming the disability community through stigma in the design, language, and implementation of all of its laws, policies, and processes. This would, of course, include MAiD legislation. One way to do this, at the very least, is to keep the end of life or reasonable foreseeability of natural death criterion. The second significant dimension of the inclusive equality model is a redistributive dimension that's geared to address socioeconomic disadvantage. In my opinion, in order to meet this criterion, there should be a very clear and significant injection of funding into end-of-life support for people who choose to live with their experiences of pain and disablement. There are also several stories now that have come up in the news and elsewhere about individuals feeling pushed into accepting MAiD because of lack of supports that would enable them to live in the community. And these are disturbing. We should pay attention to them. Last year, the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities was in Canada in April. In her report, her final report, she noted the lack of adequate services and support for people with disabilities to live in the community. In her opinion, generally, access to support is not considered a right in Canada, as it should be under the UN Convention. Rather, community support exists as a social assistance program that depends on the availability of funding, and this, of course, results in the increased use of residential institutionalization. The Special Rapporteur, interestingly, was also very concerned about the implementation of the medical assistance in dying legislation from a disability perspective. She found that there was no protocol in place to demonstrate that people with disabilities who were deemed eligible for assisted dying had been provided with any viable alternatives. So in conclusion, just to wrap up my brief remarks and to turn it over to my colleagues, I want to say that I share the concerns of the UN Special Rapporteur that the implementation of the legislation on MAiD is problematic for a number of reasons from a disability perspective. I think that the federal government needs to come to grips with the very real issue of stigma and its harmful impact on the disability community, and find ways to ensure that the legislation is not stigma-inducing, to find ways to make sure that legislation is not stigma-inducing. I think also that the end-of-life criterion is a useful one to keep. Finally, I think that the government needs to inject much more money and resources into end-of-life support. So that's what I have to say. I thank you for listening to my comments. My two colleagues on this panel will continue this discussion, and we'll also have additional specific questions.
My name is Trudeau Lemons. I'm a professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me at this important meeting. As a person with a hearing disability, I'm particularly impressed to see the accommodation for people with hearing loss. I have some slides. Okay, so my slides are there. In the Canadian media, stories abound about the emotional and physical struggle of people who want to control the manner and timing of their death, and who fear not having access to medical aid in dying, or of family members witnessing their loved ones decline and wishing there would be a more dignified way to die. These stories tell us something and deserve our empathy. Many of us have some of these experiences to share. But there are also other stories that remain largely hidden, stories which portray with all of their complexity and ambiguity the concerns and challenges we will face even more with expanding MAiD outside the end-of-life context. Here you see two pictures of people who received medical aid in dying, or euthanasia as it is called in Belgium and the Netherlands. On the top you see Tinenese surrounded by her two sisters. She was 37 years old when she was diagnosed with autism, and 2 months later her life was ended in what can be described as a sloppy medical aid and dying procedure with her traumatized family on her side. There's now a criminal case against 3 of the physicians that ended today, I believe, and where we will hear the outcome. But regardless of the outcome of the case, and there are mixed stories about what happened and what was going on, it is a story that reveals some of the problems that we will see with expanded application of medical aid and dying. On the bottom, you have Dutch elderly Hannah Gaudriaan. She suffered from what was described as speech dementia, had trouble interacting verbally with her loved ones. She had repeatedly declared that she wanted to die if she needed to go to a nursing home. Her communication skills were limited, and at the time when the documentary was made about her intention to emphasize, so the documentary was made about, which was intended to emphasize the good work of the specialized end-of-life clinic. In the documentary, we see how particularly the husband and the doctor explain her unbearable suffering that should justify ending the life of the person. She responds to questions about euthanasia. She has trouble understanding the concept, and she responds to questions about euthanasia, which are framed as huppakee weg, huppity daisy gone. So questions to simplify the concept of euthanasia. She responds, huppakee weg, huppity daisy gone. We see her in the documentary driving her car. We see her going on an outing with her husband, having a life of an elderly person with cognitive disabilities, but driving her car, drinking something in a bar, watching a skating competition. But at the end of the documentary, she's sitting down in her living room. The IV is connected. Her husband says bye. She confirms huppakee weg, huppity daisy gone. And she mumbles before she dies, "This is horrible." We do not know what she meant with "this is horrible." We also do not know that she did no longer, we can't say that she did no longer want to die. We also don't know whether Tina Nys would have continued to live, or whether she would perhaps have committed suicide if she wouldn't have received euthanasia. But we should learn from the soul searching that has happened in Belgium and the Netherlands about some of these cases of euthanasia that raise questions about the practice, particularly outside of the end-of-life context. They raise concerns about capacity assessment, about the failure of trying out all reasonable treatment options in patients who, for example, suffer from mental illness. Yesterday, a psychiatrist in Dutch newspaper De Volkskrant wrote again about the fact that many cases of mental illness in the Netherlands, of people who received euthanasia for mental illness in the Netherlands, are cases where it cannot be argued that there were no other options available because not all standard forms of treatment had been tried out. We read about loneliness, social isolation, concerns about finances, social determinants of mental health, which influence people's decision to ask for medical aid in dying. We see potential ableist assumptions among physicians who may too easily conclude that someone with a cognitive disability suffers intolerably and would be better off dead. We see also how a small minority of physicians may develop much more open standards for medical aid in dying and drive the practice in more controversial areas. These cases do raise concerns that in many of these cases, particularly outside the end of life, MAiD was too easily seen as the preferred solution to suffering, and that there was not enough focus on how to develop better care and social support to live. One key question we have to ask when thinking about these individual cases is, how do we balance the interest of those who want to have control over the manner and the timing of their death with the protection of people against premature death? Technical safeguards do not solve all these concerns. We know that informed consent reflects an ideal that is rarely realized, the capacity assessment is not an exact science, and that physicians are not well trained to assess it. There is no area of medical practice where there are no examples of some physicians being sloppy, overly zealous, or may feel too easily pressured. Errors are made in any form of medical practice. So knowing that there will be errors, that some people may die who would otherwise have lived, we have to realize that expanding outside the end-of-life context is not just about improving access to those who want it, but also about significantly expanding the number of people who risk dying prematurely, who otherwise would have continued to live. But these are more the kind of individual cases. There is indeed more, as Laverne Jacobs already mentioned here in particular. We also have to balance the desire of some to obtain state-organized, medical profession-provided life-ending interventions with the broader impact of expanding MAiD, with the broader harms related to the impact on the negative perception of the equal value of the life of those who are ill, elderly, and disabled, on suicide prevention as a broader public health goal. But let me focus on the first. It's also about how expansion of MAiD contributes to a normalization of ending life as a solution to the ailments that accompany old age, the struggle and challenges of chronic illness and life with a disability, in a society with its inherent economic, social, and healthcare-related limits. It's about how that contains in and of itself a valuing of their lives, and how it further impacts on how society, the healthcare system, even family members think of them, and on their own perception of the value and quality of their lives with disabilities, about when they think they should die rather than live. We confirm thereby in law that disability, by expanding medical aid in dying, we confirm in law that disability, chronic illness, being elderly, is a valid and reasonable reason to ask for your life to be ended. And we also have to realize that we thereby actively mobilize a professional sector supported by the state, a healthcare sector, but supported by the state to facilitate this, but only for some people, namely people with disabilities, who are elderly, and who have chronic illness. This prioritization, we should realize, also has implications for example, the availability of mental health care providers. We realize that there will be safeguards, and I know that the government realizes that. But if we expand, for example, in the mental health care context, and we mobilize mental health specialists to assess, to do an additional assessment of requests for medical aid in dying, this is time focused on the facilitation of dying, not on how to help people to live. There is social science evidence from other areas of social life that shows how legal change and the development of new legal structures around a practice impacts on how we think about and value these practices. If this is the case in other areas, why would it not happen when we confirm by law that the characteristics of being old, ill, and disabled are a valid reason to die, even if we're not in the process of dying? So I don't have much time left, 5 minutes left, but I have looked at and I've studied and I actually have written about how developments in the last 10 years, post the Carter decision particularly, and the 2 jurisdictions that have legalized MAiD by active intervention of physicians outside the end-of-life context, give us a sense that this is already what is happening. So in the last 5 minutes, let me simply give you some quick hints at some elements that identify that this ableist slip is already happening. So the first example that I want to give you is in the context of how, for example, in Belgium, there is a significant increase in the last 10 years about the number of people who receive euthanasia, although they are not close to the end of life. We're talking about people with chronic disabilities, we're talking about people with mental illness, we're talking about people who are suffering from ailments outside of the end of life. In that particular category, we see also that the Belgian Federal Euthanasia Commission has developed a new concept which is called polypathology, which describes it as a condition where the seriousness of the situation of illness is the consequence not of a disease, one disease, but of a combination of different conditions that could not be improved and that cause serious disabilities. In addition to very serious conditions such as advanced heart disease and chronic lung conditions, It includes mobility problems, including polyarthrose, tendency to fall, accompanied by pain and restrictions of the person's movement, quote, as a result of which she or he loses autonomy. Vision problems and blindness that prevent the person from reading the newspaper or a book or watching television, which makes the person dependent on care and has an isolating impact on maintaining social context. Hearing problems, and so on. So you see in Belgium, the reports indicating an increase of so-called polypathology as a basis for ending the person's life. Increased from 5% of euthanasia cases in 2012 and 2013 to nearly 10% in 2016. We see that in total between 2014 and 2017, euthanasia was performed on 484 people who were not terminally ill, who were categorized as suffering from polypathology. I think this is a significant development that indicates the kind of ageist, ableist shifts in the way we think about the appropriateness of dying. There are other examples. I can give you, for example, the development in the context of mental health, which is obviously of significant concern when we hear that the governments are considering expansion in this area. I cannot discuss this here in detail, but I simply want to point out that we see an increase in the numbers of cases who are suffering from mental illness and who have access to medical aid and dying. These numbers are not huge, but when I hear people say, well, there are no error-free areas of practice of medicine. If we would have in other areas of social life 80, 90, 100 people, in Canada it would be more because Belgium and the Netherlands have a lower population. If we would have 80 people die in circumstances that may be questionable, we would have a royal inquiry into why that is happening. Here we have in Belgium people who suffer from a variety of mental illnesses, autism, profound grief, schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder, even anxiety as basis for requesting medical aid in dying. These are conditions that create significant suffering. There is no doubt about it. And I cannot discuss here in detail, though, why these raises unique concerns related to medical aid in dying for those particular conditions. A very particular concern in mental health context is that the mere offering of MAiD as a treatment option may have a particularly negative impact on the therapeutic relation in which the transfer of hope and the creation of resilience are key for treatment success or for the ability to cope. I would simply quote here Dr. Georgia Vracas from Quebec, who wrote in the context of the Quebec debate on access to medical aid in dying from mental illness in French. D'un côté, on dit aux personnes malades que...
On the one hand, we tell sick people that suicide is not a solution, that there's help for them. On the other hand, we tell them that dying is an option. Which door will they choose? Next time I'm depressed, I hope I will not choose the door to death.
Concern about the impact of the increase of MAiD in mental health patients and also of the impact that the expansion of the MAiD practice in mental health has on others. What will this mean for Canada? I think we should be particularly concerned in the Canadian context, and I will finish with this, that we will actually have a more significant expansion than we have seen in Belgium and the Netherlands, simply because we have emphasized in the Canadian context the right to refuse treatment combined with requesting access to medical aid in dying. And I want to certainly discuss with the people from the government who are present here how that particularly raises concerns when we go outside of the end of life context, that we see that the right to refuse treatment combined with medical aid in dying becomes a right to request of the medical profession, something that the medical profession clearly has to consider to be substandard medical care. It means that we could ask from physicians who know that there are treatment options for a variety of conditions, that they are asked to do something that they know will end the life of the patient. We have to ask, is this about the practice of medicine or is this something else? And we have to realize that this has very significant consequences even of how we can kind of control the practice of medicine in those particular cases. I have to stop here. I thank you. I would urge the government also to look at the problems that we already currently have in the context of medical aid and dying, strengthen the current law for dealing with problems that we see in Belgium and the Netherlands that to some extent already exist in the context of our expanded interpretation of the concept of reasonable foreseeable death. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to the ministers and to the parliamentarians who have attended today. The inclusion of an end-of-life criterion in the legislation continues to be essential. That's the point we're making today. The failure to include this criterion would significantly discriminate against persons with disabilities. I'll explain why, and I'll end off by offering a roadmap to ensure the respect of the Charter rights to equality of all persons with disabilities in this context. So let me briefly look at where MAiD currently fits into the Canadian medical legal landscape, and I'll make 2 points to that effect. First, that MAiD, provided according to an end-of-life criterion, functions strictly as an end-of-life option premised on patient autonomy. And that's conceptually similar to other things that we've done: palliative care, the decision to refuse life-saving treatments, pulling the plug. It's different from what we did before, pre-MAiD, but not that different. Let's call it a difference of degree. Obviously, there can still exist heated societal debate as to whether it's something we want. That's what Parliament's there to decide, but it falls within a limited end-of-life framework. The second point, and this is the important one, is that the permissibility of MAiD in an end-of-life context following the Supreme Court's Carter decision is also premised on patient equality. That whereas most Canadians have access to a peaceful and painless death, some Canadians, including Gloria Taylor, who is the plaintiff in the Carter decision, did not. And what the Supreme Court effectively tells us is that that's not fair. Canadians such as Gloria Taylor merely want what others take for granted, which is an end-of-life option that is ultimately painless. So let me expand on the implications of this last point, that MAiD, provided according to a legislative end-of-life criterion, is premised on the concept of patient equality. So as I mentioned, by making people eligible for MAiD at the end of life, the state seeks to ensure that all people have access to a painless death. But the most important point is the negative of that statement, which is also true, that by providing MAiD on an end-of-life basis, the state treats the suffering of all people who are not at the end of their lives equally. That is a situation worth addressing through means other than the termination of the life. In other words, the solution to suffering, not in an end-of-life context, isn't the termination of that life. And that's a universal proposition. It's important to note this doesn't deny the suffering of these people, which in many cases can be extensive. There are people who aren't at the end of their lives who suffer tremendously, beyond what most can imagine, whether from disease, personal circumstances and history, psychological trouble, whatever it is. There are also groups, and we're very aware of this, that suffer disproportionately. So historically, it was true for women. It may also still be true in many contexts. If we think of modern-day transgendered individuals, they suffer tremendous stigma in our society. Indigenous people, particularly in some areas, who suffer stigma, abuse, psychological trauma resulting from the history of residential schools and other awful policies. Individuals who are addicted to substances, and yes, persons with disabilities. The refusal of the state to agree to the termination of their lives isn't a denial of their suffering. and we have to keep that in mind, but rather an affirmation of the worth of their lives. By treating their suffering equally in a non-end-of-life context, the state also recognizes that if we treated the suffering of one group differently from the suffering of all the others, and we would be making this distinction based on personal, charter-protected characteristics, it would have an impact on their dignity, their self-worth, the worth ascribed to them by others, and the likelihood that this group would be stereotyped. This would be true for any group, all the groups I mentioned, be it women, transgendered individuals, Indigenous people, individuals who are addicted to substances, person with disabilities, any other group you can think of. Instead, we agree that the suffering of these groups must be treated as a crisis situation worthy of state mobilization and intervention, but not and absolutely not through the termination of their lives. That's a good thing. That's what we want. One last point about suffering. Society assumes that persons with disabilities are unhappy and live a life of misery, whereas the empirical evidence reveals that this is a perception. And that reality is completely different. And this was the evidence that came out from Tom Shakespeare, who testified in the Truchon case, that persons with disabilities are often happy, believe they have a good quality of life, not to say that some of them don't suffer and don't wish, tragically, that they could die, but that's the same for any broadly defined group. And persons who become disabled over the course of their lives at first experience a period of trauma and difficulty where they perceive their situation as being devoid of quality of life, but that changes after some time and they are able, for the most part, to adapt and live full lives. The majority of persons come to terms with their disability over time. The hopelessness decreases after 3 months and remains high throughout the first year, but ultimately decreases. So here's where rubber meets road. The failure to include an end-of-life criterion in MAiD legislation would be discriminatory. And here's why. The removal of an end-of-life criterion would treat the suffering of persons with disabilities differently from the suffering of other groups. If someone with a disability who suffers requests MAiD, what happens? Or someone without a disability who suffers requests MAiD, what happens? The state would refuse it on the grounds that their lives are worth fighting for, or in the words of Catherine Frazee, we can't afford to lose these individuals. If someone with a disability who suffers requests MAiD without the end-of-life criterion, what happens? The state would approve it, again, on the grounds that we can afford to lose you. Let's remember, persons with disabilities suffer, and persons without disabilities suffer. Some persons with disabilities want to end their lives, and tragically, they do. And some people without disabilities also want to end their lives, and tragically do. Without the end-of-life criterion, the state would agree to the termination of the lives of persons with disabilities while urging the other suffering individuals, rightfully so, as it should for everyone else, to live. Let me put this another way. In the Truchon case, one of the plaintiffs testified movingly that she was at the bottom of the basement staircase and had no chance of ever climbing back up any steps. If the end-of-life criterion is ultimately removed, the state would effectively be telling a person with a disability who suffers, you, person with a disability, and only you are at the bottom of the basement staircase. We know there are other groups. We know that they suffer, but they have hope. You are irremediable. We agreed that you will never again have a good quality of life, unlike all those other people who suffer. For this reason, only you can have access to the choice that ends all choices. Other individuals who suffer greatly can't because they're not at the bottom of the basement staircase. And that's an incredibly discriminatory and powerful message for the state to put forward. The impact of treating persons with disabilities in this way would fuel, how could it not, the existing stereotypes that persons with disability are better off dead, that they are a burden on the state and their loved ones, that they have a lousy quality of life, that their lives have less value than the lives of others, and that they are at the bottom of the basement staircase of life without the chance to move back up. This is literally unlike every single other group of persons who disproportionately suffer, whose suffering we treat as indicating the need for more social programs, more help, and whose lives are perceived as essential, lives that we can't afford to lose in our society. These stereotypes would impact the thoughts and perceptions of those with and without disabilities, and would over time lead persons with disability to access MAiD. This explains why, and the ministers might recall this from the legislative debates following the Carter decision, virtually every single disability organization supported the end-of-life criterion. Judging by media coverage, you might think support was divided, but it wasn't. Every disability organization, save one that I'm aware of, fought for an end-of-life criterion because it's what we need so that persons with disabilities are not stereotyped, marginalized, and ultimately offered death as a state, quote-unquote, benefit for their condition. You can imagine the uproar if the state offered death as a benefit to suffering members of other groups based on protected personal characteristics. Continuing to ignore the equality rights of persons with disabilities will ultimately result in further litigation. And I use the words continuing to ignore because, and here's what's particularly galling, despite so far 2 cases on MAiD in the last few years, Carter and Truchon, the court still hasn't addressed the argument that I've made on the equality of persons with disabilities. Specifically, whether the objective of ensuring the equal protection of every life and the avoidance of negative stereotypes about the lives of persons with disabilities can justify the existence of an end-of-life criterion. In Carter, the court found that, well, we were dealing with old legislation, and so it just wasn't the objective of that legislation to protect persons with disabilities. In Truchon, there were extensive parliamentary debates on the point, but the court claimed that on the evidence, it actually wasn't a legislative objective to protect persons with disabilities, but rather merely a guiding principle, which allowed the court then to ignore this guiding principle. This is obviously frustrating, given that parliamentary debates were quite clear that this was a fundamental objective of the legislation. More importantly, in my mind, this is why the government's justification under Section 1 of the Charter failed in Truchon. The court circumvented the need to assess whether the equal protection of every life and the avoidance of negative stereotypes justified the existence of the end-of-life criterion. And despite arguments on this point, it never considered that removing the end-of-life criterion would provide for disability or illness to serve as a justification for the termination of life in a way that no other personal characteristic could, and that it would mark disability as a burden worse than death while compounding existing discrimination and devaluation. I repeat, the courts haven't considered this argument in any substantive way. They've run around the issue to this point. What does it mean? It means that first, through carefully crafted legislation, it's still very reasonable and very credible to make this argument as a justification for an end-of-life criterion. In other words, an end-of-life criterion of some kind can, and I would say must, be defended on the grounds that it protects the equality of persons with disabilities. Conversely, if a new legislation fails to include an end-of-life criterion, it will obviously expose itself to litigation from the communities that the government has abandoned. The message it would send is that the government agrees the lives of some persons who suffer aren't worth protecting at all costs, and that's a very solid ground for litigation. Let's be clear, the new law isn't going to make everyone happy. The government's in a very, very difficult position, and regardless of where it lands, there could be litigation. What does this mean? It means 2 things, and I'll close on this. First, we need legislation that includes some form of an end-of-life criterion. We've heard why, I think, in very powerful terms today. Not only can this criterion be justified, but it has to be justified. We can't afford not to justify it for the sake of persons with disabilities. Second, given the potential for litigation from all sides, the creation of new legislation is a fine balancing act. The draft legislation, as a result, should be put before the Supreme Court of Canada in a reference to ensure its constitutionality and limit subsequent litigation. This will allow the court to balance the competing rights at stake, something, as I've mentioned, the courts have consistently refused to do so far. It will establish the constitutionality of the new MAiD legislation once and for all, and put an end to what's effectively been a decade-long process of constitutional challenges. It will be the most effective way, I think, to ensure the constitutionality of this legislation. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Heidi Jams. I am chair of CCD's Ending of Life Ethics Committee. And let's hope that my technology works.
Parliamentarians, staff, and fellow members of the Canadian disability community, I would like to add my personal thanks to you for taking the time to come together today to think and talk about the importance of balancing autonomy rights with equality rights, as we consider new legislation to govern the practice of medical aid in dying. Canada prides itself on being an inclusive society. Indeed, Canada enjoys an international reputation for being a country that welcomes and includes people from every race, nation, color, creed, and ability. Well, actually, evidence shows that, when it comes to welcoming and including people with disabilities, Canada's social rhetoric of inclusion often turns into an illusion. I am here today to talk with you about ableism, what it is, how its continued prevalence in Canadian society results in the ongoing marginalization and social devaluation of people with disabilities. And, ultimately, I am here today to help you understand why the continued prevalence of ableism in Canada in 2020 makes it incumbent upon the federal government to ensure that the new legislation governing medical aid in dying balances autonomy rights with equality rights by maintaining some sort of end-of-life requirement in new MAiD legislation. A failure to achieve such a balance in new MAiD legislation would enshrine into law the quintessential ableist stereotype that people are better off dead than disabled. So, let's begin with the most basic question. What is ableism? Disability scholar Veronica Chouinard defines ableism as ideas, practices, institutions and social relations that presume able-bodiedness, and by so doing, construct persons with disabilities as marginalized and largely invisible others. Canadian disability scholar Gregor Wolbring notes that, quote, ableism and preference of certain abilities has been rampant throughout history. Ableism shaped and continues to shape areas such as human security, social cohesion, social policies, and relationships among social groups. Ableism is one of the most societally entrenched and accepted isms. End quote. I find Professor Wolbring's summary of the all-encompassing scope of influence that ableism has in contemporary Western society to be quite accurate. Clear, yet unacknowledged, evidence of ableism can be seen in everything from the way in which buildings are built to exclude people who do not walk or see, to the way in which students with disabilities are taught that it's better to look, move, and behave as much like their non-disabled peers as possible, to the way in which terms associated with disability are used as insults in common parlance. Unlike sexism or racism, however, ableism remains a largely unacknowledged form of discrimination. Just as other forms of discrimination, like sexism or racism, operate on interpersonal, internal, and systemic levels, there are also interpersonal, internalized, and systemic forms of ableism. Interpersonal ableism can most basically be defined as an act of disability-based discrimination that a non-disabled person carries out against a person with disabilities in a one-on-one context. Internalized ableism can be defined as the process by which a disabled person absorbs the ableist attitudes that non-disabled people have repeatedly exhibited towards him or her, and begins to believe that his or her disabilities actually do make him or her inferior to non-disabled people. Many people with disabilities experience internalized ableism, either episodically or consistently throughout their lives. In her seminal book, Contours of Ableism, disability scholar Fiona Kumari Campbell describes the phenomenon of internalized ableism in the following terms. From the moment a child is born, he or she emerges into a world where he or she receives messages that to be disabled is to be less than, a world where disability may be tolerated but in the final instance, is inherently negative. We are all, regardless of our status, shaped and formed by the politics of ableism." End quote. Systemic ableism can be defined as patterns of discriminatory and exclusionary practices against people with disabilities which become entrenched in sectors which are fundamental to societal membership, sectors such as education, employment, and housing. Limited access and opportunities in one of these key sectors, such as education, often automatically leads to further restrictions in employment opportunities, which, in turn, limits housing options. Ableism thus becomes systemic. Because of our time constraints here today, I'm going to limit my examination of systemic ableism in Canada to the two sectors which are most often linked to MAiD in the context of people with disabilities, namely, housing and related personal support services, and healthcare. When it comes to accessible housing and personal support services to allow people with disabilities to live independently in the community, the story that the statistics tell is a grim one, indeed. In September 2014, the CBC radio program, The Current, reported that, in Ontario alone, 5,338 people with disabilities and under age 65 were admitted to nursing homes between 2008 and 2012. Data from the 2016 census indicates that there were 11,320 people with disabilities and under age 65 living in nursing homes in 2015. It must be acknowledged that there are some instances where younger adults requiring a high level of care do find that their care needs are more effectively met in long-term care facilities than they were in the community. Nevertheless, the fact that the number of people with disabilities who are under age 65 and living in nursing homes is increasing, rather than decreasing, remains, in and of itself, very troubling. It's troubling because, behind each of those numbers is the story of a disabled Canadian who could not find sufficient supports to be able to successfully live independently in the community alongside their non-disabled friends, family and peers. This, despite the fact that a growing body of research indicates that people with all types of disabilities, even those considered severely disabled, benefit by living in typical housing in the community, as opposed to living in an institution or an institution-like congregate living facility. And, ultimately, it's troubling because it is a strong indicator that, rather than becoming increasingly inclusive of people with disabilities, by developing more of the supports that would make it possible for them to live in the community, Canadian society is actually increasingly reverting to its historical ableist practice of segregating people with disabilities from their non-disabled counterparts by institutionalizing them. Now, let's take a look at access to healthcare for Canadians with disabilities. Healthcare has traditionally been viewed as a benevolent discipline in which every human life is valued equally, without any form of prejudice or discrimination. While this may remain the ideal to which healthcare aspires, the reality is that, as individuals, healthcare professionals are not immune to the influence of dominant societal understandings of, and attitudes towards, individuals and groups of people deemed to be others. Galli and colleagues observe that despite their intentions, personal goals and normative expectations, even health professionals are unconscious bearers of implicit social biases that affect the quality of professional interventions. Grounding the phenomenon of ableism in a biomedical understanding of disability, Campbell defines ableism as a network of beliefs, processes and practices that produces a particular kind of self and body, the corporeal standard, that is projected as the perfect, species-typical and therefore essential and fully human. Disability, then, is cast as a diminished state of being human. Campbell goes on to point out that, quote, medicine has operated as the primary paradigm not only for the treatment of disabled bodies but has also shaped the way decision-makers, legislators, families and society in general think about and sense disability. End quote. Despite the major role that medical professionals play in the lives of people with disabilities, studies have consistently shown that, as a group, healthcare professionals tend to substantially underestimate the quality of life of people with disabilities. Such erroneous judgments about the quality of life experienced by people with disabilities can result in treatment options for people with disabilities being either limited or altogether eliminated. At the heart of such decisions is what disability scholar Joel Reynolds has termed the ableist conflation of disability, suffering, and death. Quote, wherever operative, the ableist conflation flattens communication about disability to communication about pain, suffering, hardship, disadvantage, morbidity, and mortality. End quote. What makes medical ableism so dangerous and so insidious at the same time is that it often presents as common sense. James Cherney argues that ableism is that most insidious form of rhetoric that has become reified and so widely accepted as common sense that it denies its own rhetoricity. It goes without saying. Within this milieu of common sense ableism, people with disabilities are routinely made vulnerable in medical settings. For example, studies have consistently shown that the emergency department environment can be stressful for people with developmental disabilities and/or communication disabilities, both because deficits associated with these conditions hamper these individuals' ability to communicate their concerns, and because staff often do not have the skills needed to work with them. Furthermore, common sense ableism in medicine very often results in the application of a utilitarian approach to defining extraordinary, heroic, and futile measures which may be employed to preserve or prolong human life. The danger that this poses for people with disabilities entering the medical realm is that things which are considered routine parts of daily living within the disability community, such as the use of feeding tubes and respirators, can suddenly become indicators of an unacceptably low quality of life. Repeated and prolonged exposure to this kind of ableism in healthcare settings can cause people with disabilities to internalize the ableism and resulting stigmatization which they have experienced. As Sharon Watchsler explains, when people with disabilities repeatedly hear such messages of our uselessness, it causes psychic damage that sometimes combines in a deadly way with the material deprivations of ableism, and its usual attendant, impoverishment. Ultimately, then, the prevalence of ableism within Canada's healthcare system renders many doctors' offices, clinics, laboratories, and hospitals inaccessible and are unsafe spaces for disabled Canadians. Systemic ableism thus commonly prevents Canadians with disabilities from furthering their education, finding employment, and living how, where, and with whom they choose, while most non-disabled Canadians take these things for granted. Furthermore, the prevalence of medical ableism regularly prevents Canadians with disabilities from getting access to timely healthcare that is responsive to their needs and respectful of their ways of being in the world. The ongoing systemic ableism that disabled Canadians face daily is well documented. Yet, many still dismiss systemic ableism as sufficient grounds for preserving legislative safeguards, such as an end-of-life criterion, to limit access to MAiD. The preoccupation with protecting autonomy rights is somehow seen as more real, more urgent, than a need to lessen the risk that people with disabilities will be compelled to choose MAiD as an ultimate capitulation to the cumulative effects of societal, medical, and internalized ableism. So, I'd like to connect some dots for you in terms of the ways in which systemic ableism leads to the infringement of the human rights of Canadians with disabilities, thus undermining their human dignity and exacerbating internalized ableism. Finally, I will demonstrate how, without the preservation of an end-of-life criterion in MAiD legislation, the lethal combination of systemic, medical, and internalized ableism can ultimately lead to terminal weariness and despair, resulting in a request for MAiD. Since the legalization of MAiD in 2016, we have already seen people with disabilities become so worn down by systemic ableism that they have been compelled to choose MAiD after being repeatedly denied the supports they need to live. One such person was Sean Taggart. Mr. Taggart, who had ALS, spent the last months of his life fighting, unsuccessfully, to get 4 more hours of care per day from home care. Any disabled person who's had to engage in a battle with bureaucracy over services, and we are legion, can attest to how physically and emotionally exhausting such battles are, even when our health is not declining. The only option given to him for receiving the 24/7 care he required was moving into a long-term care facility that was 4 hours away from his home and his family, including his young son. What's more, the long-term care facility had informed him that his room would be too small to accommodate the computer system which he used to communicate. Ultimately, Sean Taggart chose suicide via MAiD because his other choices were untenable. Mr. Taggart's case is among those which raise deep concerns about the lack of compatibility between, even, Canada's previous MAiD legislation and its commitments as a signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD. Other such cases include that of Archie Rolland, who, in 2016, ended his life under Quebec's euthanasia law because he, also, was denied the supports that he needed to live in the community, and faced incarceration in a long-term care facility. Even the plaintiffs in the Trishone case made it crystal clear in their statement of claim that death was preferable to being forced into an institution. All of these cases are indicative of Canada's ongoing failure to meet its commitments as a signatory to the CRPD. Article 10 of the CRPD ensures the right to life and its effective enjoyment by persons with disabilities on an equal basis with others, while Article 19 provides for the right to live independently and be included in one's community. At the end of her official visit to Canada in April 2019, Ms. Catalina Devandas Aguilar, the UN's Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, stated that she is, quote, extremely concerned about the implementation of the legislation on medical assistance in dying from a disability perspective. I have been informed that there is no protocol in place to demonstrate that persons with disabilities have been provided with viable alternatives when eligible for assisted dying. I have further received worrisome claims about persons with disabilities in institutions being pressured to seek medical assistance in dying, and practitioners not formally reporting cases involving persons with disabilities. I urge the federal government to investigate these complaints and put into place adequate safeguards to ensure that persons with disabilities do not request assistive dying simply because of the absence of community-based alternatives and palliative care. End quote. In this statement, Ms. Devandas Aguilar is unequivocal in drawing a link between a lack of community-based personal supports and palliative care for people with disabilities and the inevitability that this lack of community-based supports will force more people with disabilities to seek to have their deaths hastened through MAiD. Failure to reinstate an end-of-life criterion into new MAiD legislation would surely exacerbate this problem. We dare not ignore these sobering evidences of the ongoing prevalence of ableism, and the consequent incompatibility of Canada's previous MAiD legislation with its commitment, under the CRPD, to uphold the human rights of people with disabilities. To act in such ignorance would make a mockery of Canada's long-standing international reputation as a leader in human rights. We are here today as leaders of the Canadian disability rights movement because we believe that Canada is on the verge of giving legal sanction to assisted death as a legitimate alternative to assisted life. This would essentially render Canadians with disabilities a disposable population. We must not let this happen. We are, therefore, calling on Canadian legislators to undertake the hard and careful work needed to go beyond simply giving people with disabilities access to assisted death in lieu of assisted life, and declaring that, to be equality, only with such discernment in crafting the new legislation governing medical aid in dying will Canada be able to remain true to its history and reputation as a defender of human rights. If, however, legislators simply listen to the loudest voices in this debate, and provide a means for people with disabilities to die in lieu of sufficient supports to help us live, be assured that the disability rights community will continue to fight such lethal discrimination, in our nation's courts, and beyond. Thank you for listening. Canadians with disabilities are hoping and praying that you will act on what you have heard here this morning. Our lives depend on it.
Thank you very much, Heidi. And on that note, we have an opportunity now before our Q&A to ask Minister Qualtrough, who has been with us this entire time and who has been an ardent defender and champion of the rights of persons with disabilities. And in the first round of this, and it continues to be in the second round of Bill C-14 discussions and deliberations, and we are extremely pleased to have her with us this morning and want to give her an opportunity to offer some reflections.
Hello everyone, bonjour tout le monde. My name, as you know, is Carla Qualtrough, and I am the Federal Minister for Employment, Workforce Development, and Disability Inclusion. I'm also one of 3 ministers within the federal government tasked with taking on what you all recognize is the very hard and important task of responding to Touchant and ultimately embarking on the 5-year parliamentary review of this law that will begin in June. So that's where we are, and I would like to offer to you the comments that I have made at every roundtable I've participated in, and I want to acknowledge what I consider to be quite important step that we've taken as a government by adding a 3rd leg to the stool of discussions that perhaps wasn't present in other formal discussions, which is that of the voice of Canadians with disabilities. Having me at the table means that my job is to ensure that you, all of you, every single one of you is heard, and that your perspectives are considered, and in some ways most considered, given the very real reality that every single person, by definition, that access is MAiD has some form of disability. So we know how hard disability advocates in this country have fought for personal autonomy. It's a sacred right, it's a sacred choice to be able to make the choices for yourself, about yourself, and the life you choose to live. We've fought those battles. We've also fought for equality, for the very fundamental right of every life to be seen and valued as equal to every other life. Every time legislatures and courts look at balancing rights, there is a challenge before us because we have to find a path through what are often competing rights, but quite frankly, that's our job. And it's hard, and we shouldn't be able to say that we didn't do right by people because it was hard. So you'll never hear that from me. I've heard loud and clear what you're saying, that this is an issue of equality of life, not of quality of life. So I very clearly understand what you are all saying today and the message you're sending to us as a federal government about the equality rights that are seen to be in jeopardy as we chart this path forward. I am here to tell you that the legislative objective of ensuring the equal value of every life is going to be of paramount importance to me personally, and that every discussion at the table that I have will certainly bring that up. I said in 2016 at a forum similar to this that living with a disability is not a fate worse than death. I know I live with a disability, and even having the level of function I have as someone who's legally blind, I can tell you the number of times that somebody has said stupid, unthoughtful, uncaring things about how could I possibly live like this? How could I, I mean, dumb things, but you hear it all the time. If that ever happened to me, I'd rather be dead. If I couldn't drive, how can you live? How can you be independent? I don't drive, big deal. I'm making these points to assure you that I'm hearing you and that we're hearing you. We know that there is a lack of sufficient supports, disability supports, social service supports for Canadians living with disabilities. It's unacceptable. The challenge of our federation, of course, is that it's not all federal jurisdiction, it's not all provincial jurisdiction. Shouldn't be an excuse, isn't an excuse, I'm just explaining. We also know that it shouldn't be harder to access supports than it is to access MAiD. And we want to make sure that we think of that very, very carefully as we move forward. All of this to say is that we're taking this responsibility extremely seriously. There is no other file or issue on my desk in front of me that matters more. How we move forward as a government will define a significant part of our legacy as this government. What I can tell you is that with the Accessible Canada Act and the all-party consent that we received, the only piece of government legislation that received all-party consent in the last government, we have allies in all parties to ensure that the rights of Canadians with disabilities are upheld. And I know that this will not be a partisan issue. It's too important and the stakes are too high. So know that you have an ally in me. I'm listening. I thank you for your candor. It's hard to hear, and we can always do better. Thank you.
Minister Qualtrough, thank you very much. We really appreciate having you here with us today. I'd like to also ask you to pass on our thanks to your colleague, Minister MAiD, for joining us the time that he had available. We have just a couple of minutes left before we have to wrap up here. We'd like to go to a question and answer session. I wonder if there are any questions that have come from offline, from people who are viewing live stream. If so, maybe we'd start with that. Thanks. Okay. Okay, I guess it's just a general question for anyone on the panel. It says, can you speak to the balance of communication supports and decision making and the interpretation of those decisions and access to MAiD? Does anybody care to respond to that? I can repeat it if you'd like. Grab the handheld microphone.
Heidi, are you interested in, you wanted to take that one? Yeah, I thought maybe.
As someone who lives with communication disability,
As someone who lives with a communication disability,
I just tell you that the scariest place.
I can tell you that the scariest place for me is
Yeah.
the ER.
And that's because without someone to interpret or echo my speech,
And that's because without somebody to echo my speech,
medical professionals often assume
medical professionals often assume
my release. I know people with disabilities
medical professionals often assume that they know my wishes.
Professional people
And I personally know people
with disabilities who have gone into hospital.
I personally know people with disabilities that have gone into hospital
For conditions like pneumonia,
with conditions like pneumonia,
serious but curable,
serious but curable,
who have been offered MAiD.
and they have been offered MAiD.
So, I think that speaks to the need.
So I think that speaks to the need,
Unfortunately,
for people with disabilities to protect themselves to protect ourselves against medical practitioners. Some medical practitioners, not all.
Thanks very much, Heidi. Appreciate that. Trudeau, do you have a comment as well?
Speak from the other side as somebody with hearing loss and who uses now a cochlear implant, because I think in this context and in relation to this question of a case of that we already had in Canada of a 62-year-old man, Alan Nichols, who requested medical aid in dying in BC, but who had the cochlear implant that he was not using. He was suffering from depression. So there was a combination of mental issues, suicidality when he was accepted or admitted to the hospital. The family was only informed about his request for medical aid in dying very shortly before he received it. And I can think there, I mean, I don't know the details of the case and I cannot judge how communication happened, but for sure the family had trouble reaching him in the circumstances of the case, having somebody with a cochlear implant which he refused to use, mental issues who compounded his ability to communicate with his family members. So you see there how these issues are very often not clear-cut. They're a mixture of things. That we were dealing with people who enter the medical system, who enter an emergency room, who enter in this case, a mental health ward, who have troubles communicating, who may not be adequately heard, but who also may not be adequately able to communicate and interact with family members who care about their well-being, healthcare providers who may unconsciously presume that their suffering is very serious.
We have a second question here. The question is very simply, what is civil society's role in MAiD? And as I understand it, Bonnie wanted to make a response to that. So we get a microphone for Bonnie?
I got it. Thanks. So Audrey King, Madame Gladue, and I have something in common. We all have post-polio syndrome. And again, you know, building off the work that Dawn Canada has done around gender-based violence, this is the ultimate in gender-based violence. This is institutionalized femicide as far as Dawn Canada is concerned, and that's the position we've taken on this change in terms of what it means. Not now, but down the road in terms of what we've understood from hearing from lots of different people, what happens over time in terms of the longer legislation like that's in place, the higher the risks become for different people. And of course, we're talking about ourselves. Carmela, my president, everybody talking about this fear of accessing medical services. We've had anecdotal evidence from members of my organization that they have gone into the hospital to seek medical assistance and been offered MAiD. I do not understand why civil society organizations have not been given the resources to do proper qualitative research about what is actually going on and has been going on already with the imminent death clause in place, because we already have evidence to show that there's already serious problems that are not being reported through the data that's being collected. And I really, again, do not understand what the rush is. This is a marathon, as Catherine reminded all of us. And so again, around the context of the CRPD, and that we're now looking at reflecting on how we're going to go forward with monitoring the CRPD while not respecting the fundamental tenets of the CRPD, we need to be able to monitor from a civil society perspective. We cannot leave our lives in the hands of a medical community that is not properly educated in the context of human rights. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. Appreciate that. We have time for perhaps one more question. Is there a question from the floor? I see in the center. Kira? Okay. Can you make it brief, please?
Yeah. My name is Smati Mora Severino. I had an op-ed published under the Toronto Star called, "Is Medically Assisted Dying a Choice If Persons with Disabilities Aren't Given the Necessary Supports to Live?" I'm a PhD student in health policy and equity, and my dissertation is exactly what you were talking about. It's about examining the experiences of people with disabilities in accessing MAiD in relation to accessing home care supports and palliative care supports. I'm doing a scoping review right now, and under the scoping review, there is no literature in the world that currently exists that examines how state supports may impact the decisions people with disabilities make. I'm a mother of a child with complex needs. He's 7 years old, and he's part of the complex care program at CCD. That program cultivates quality of life. But I would never leave my son alone in the pediatric ICU at CCD because physicians on that ward do not see my son as somebody that should live and as somebody as futile care. We have our own personal experience where an able-bodied individual, child, accidentally, under medical error that could have happened to anybody, ended up with severe hypoxia. And the conversation about saving his life quickly turned into he was futile care. And the parents said, if we keep our son alive, all the care is going to fall on us, and we can't do it. And that is why removing the criteria for nearing death is essentially should not be removed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have a response to that comment, or no? No, okay. I saw one more hand. You take one final question. It was in the center of the room. I thought.
Thank you. My name is Debbie Sadlanaga. I'm a Thana doula, a volunteer hospice worker, and I am also a member of the Disability Advisory Council for Dying with Dignity Canada. And I just wanted to say, with regards to what has been said today, it's very informative and everything. But I wish to say that CCAL, CCD, and other listed groups don't speak for all Canadians with disabilities and don't represent the opinions of us at the Disability Advisory Council for Dying with Dignity Canada. We feel that with regards to the Truchon case and Glado case, that there are a lot of safeguards in place already. And I seem to hear the theme today that yes, obviously there are a lot of things that are necessary for people living with disabilities. I'm fully aware of that. But the thing that is really missing in the discussions today is the fact that this going before the legislation is with regards to personal autonomy. People with disabilities are really being grouped together. We disagree with individuals and organizations that put us in groupings and categorize us as vulnerable. Not all elderly, ill, or disabled people are vulnerable to the point where they need someone else to speak on their behalf. Whether regarding us as vulnerable people or not, we also agree with Justice Baudouin that there are sufficient safeguards in the law, even with the repeal of the reasonably foreseeable death clause. As recently noted by the BC Civil Liberties Association, the existing MAiD law already has layers of safeguards that place strict limits on who can access MAiD. These safeguards provide strong protection even after eligibility is broadened to include individuals who are not near death. Canada's experience shows that the MAiD law is safely and responsibly implemented by medical practitioners. Disability Advisory Council for Dying with Dignity Canada also commends to amending the law to permit advance requests for MAiD as recommended by the Special Joint Parliamentary Committee on Physician-Assisted Dying in 2016. The current ban on advance requests unfairly prohibits many people with capacity-eroding conditions such as dementia or patients who have been accepted, yet due to immeasurable amounts of pain and discomfort, are heavily medicated and therefore rendered mentally unfit. Again, citing the previous points from Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we believe that the choice of a peaceful and pain-free death can be made available in advance directives for those Canadians wishing to pursue MAiD. When discussing vulnerable people, Justice Baudouin also touched on the suicide contagion. One of our members of our council recently completed his thesis on the suicide contagion in MAiD in Belgium and found there is no statistical correlation between the implementation of assisted dying and the suicide rate. The author has defended his thesis and hopes to have it published soon, and I have studied his abbreviated version and was interested to find that not only is there no correlation between MAiD and the suicide rate, but a population-wide change in suicide ideation may not even affect suicides at all. Evidence for this statement comes from a Belgian study of 100 consecutive assisted dying applicants who applied on the sole basis of a mental disorder. And the study reported that 48 of these applications were accepted, but 8 withdrew.
If you have a question, trying to wrap things up here, do you have a particular question that you'd like to ask?
My question is basically, are we talking about the same legislation, because the whole concept is regarding the autonomy, individual autonomy as it relates within the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Not looking at a group saying, we're disabled, we have difficulties functioning in society, we need more assistance with regards to housing and employment and support. This is given, but we're speaking today with regards to medical assistance in dying and the option that is made available to every Canadian, disabled or not. We have a choice. And the group saying that we're going to be stigmatized or stereotyped because of disability is not offering people the choice.
Okay, thank you very much. Nicholas, we wonder if perhaps you might make a response, and then I saw Heidi's hand as well.
Yeah, I think autonomy is important. The Charter recognizes that autonomy is important. It also recognizes the need to balance autonomy with other values that we hold to be just as dear: equality, non-discrimination. And I think the point of today's discussion was to suggest let's not forget about these other values, which are just as essential to significant groups of the population. Constraints on autonomy for the purposes of equality and non-discrimination are fairly routine, simply because a law may breach, in a certain sense, autonomy. It doesn't mean that it's not constitutional. There are many ways to justify it. And we seem to accept this as well in the context of MAiD. Not everyone can die on demand, and that doesn't seem to be the debate in Canada. The issue seems to be in what context and what constraints are we going to impose on the autonomy of individuals. And the issue is, do we want to provide MAiD on a non-discriminatory basis that ensures the safety and a lack of stigma for an entire group, an entire population that has been marginalized time and time over again through Canadian history? Or do we want to simply give up on that population, buy into the stereotypes, buy into the stigmatization, and say, yeah, you know what, at the end of the day, there's a few people who would like this from that group, and so we'll give it to them because their life's really not worth fighting for anyways. I think that's the debate that we're having.
Thanks, Nicholas. Heidi, make a point, and then Trudeau. Okay, we need to wrap things up here, folks.
My only point, the only point I want to make.
The only point that I want to make
The central flaw
the central flaw
your logic
in your logic
that someone can declare
that someone can declare that they can declare that their life isn't worth living if they become disabled.
Without declaring that my life also is not worth living.
Without declaring that my life is also worth not living.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Trudeau?
May I speak as I'm a doctor? May I speak as a doctor?
So I want to simply add to the comments made before me that autonomy is not a divine concept. It's not something that is abstract and completely separate and completely disconnected from the lived reality in which we find ourselves. It's not like that even in the quite autonomy-focused interpretation that we see in our legal system. We do have measures in place in our society that restricts Canadians' liberty to engage in certain actions that may harm their life. We can think here of the restriction of Canadians to take unapproved drugs. We can think here about restriction based on people who would want to participate in high-risk research, where we prohibit or we prevent people from doing so. These are actions where people may want to have unapproved drugs because they think it may save their lives. So if we can restrict the liberty of people who believe that they want to save their lives, why would it be absolutely unthinkable that we would have restrictions on autonomy for the purpose of saving them? I think it makes no sense. It's ideology. Second thing I want to point out, the issue is raised of the Belgium and the suicide rates and the impact of opening up mental health as a reason for accessing medical aid in dying. It's often presented as if providing access to medical aid in dying may connect people to healthcare providers who will then potentially either lead them to better care or help them to die with dignity and avoid a horrible suicide. There is no evidence that this actually happens, and I would invite Dying with Dignity to put on the table any evidence that there is no evidence that providing access to medical aid in dying outside of the context of end of life and for reasons of mental health reduces suicide rates. I think that's absolutely not proven. And also the idea that it actually prevents people who otherwise would commit horrible suicide. There are anecdotal reports, but there is no strong evidence that this actually happens.
Thank you very much to all of you. Krista, you're gone? Okay. I guess it falls to me to thank the panel members once again and to thank you all for coming and being with us here this morning with these important discussions. As I've been reflecting and thinking about things today, people have talked a lot about March 11th and the fact that that's the date of things moving forward. And I can't help but reflect in my own mind that the day before that, March 10th, will be the 10th anniversary of the day that Canada ratified the CRPD in New York City. So we've moved a long way in those 10 years. And I hope that we can use the convention and the spirit of the convention to move us forward in these discussions, in these talks. So again, thank you all for coming this morning. Appreciate your time. And with that, let's wrap things up, okay? Thanks very much.